dark secrets of an old church, a priest's sacrifice, and an evil that never goes away. This is a scary, mystical story that will give you goosebumps. On an old highway leading deep into the American outback, there is an abandoned church that the locals prefer not to talk about. A crumbling spire, dirty windows, and a cracked sign with a faded inscription, Church of Saint Augustine. All this gives the building an ominous aura. They say that terrible things happened here, but the real mystical story begins with a young priest who arrived here one night. Father Michael was a man of faith, but like everyone else, he was not without doubts. He often had to deal with human sins, and he firmly believed that he could return even the most lost to the path of truth. So when the bishop asked him to restore St. Augustine Church and attract parishioners again, Michael agreed. He did not know that he was in for not just a test of faith, but also something that would make him doubt the reality of existence itself. The first night in the church was unusual. Michael brought a few things with him: an old Bible, a cross, and a lantern. He was told that the building had been empty for a long time, and no one came here. But when he entered, he felt a strange presence, as if the walls of the church were watching him. A slight chill ran down his spine when he noticed that one of the candles on the altar had lit itself. "Probably a draft," Michael whispered, trying to convince himself. But that was only the beginning. That night, the priest heard a quiet whisper coming from the depths of the church. He decided to check out what was going on. Footsteps echoed in the empty building, and the weak light of the lantern illuminated the peeling walls covered in strange symbols. Michael found them on the back wall, where the icon used to be. These symbols were unlike anything he had seen before. They seemed to pulse, emitting an ominous energy. The next morning, Michael went to the nearest village to learn more about the church's past. The locals looked away when he asked about it. Finally, one of the old men told him a story. "This church was cursed," he began, his voice shaking. "They say there was a priest here who lost his faith. His name was Father Ezra. He was into the occult and tried to summon spirits to prove that the afterlife existed. But something went wrong. People who came to him for help began to disappear. And one day, he himself was found dead, right on the altar. After that, no one came here anymore." Michael thought about it. He didn't believe in the occult, but he couldn't ignore the strange events that had already begun to happen to him. He decided to return to the church and consecrate it, to drive out any darkness that might have settled here. That night, he began the consecration ceremony. But as soon as he raised the cross and said the first prayer, the candles around him lit up by themselves. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the air became thick, as if filled with smoke. Suddenly, an ominous laugh came from the corner. Michael turned his head and saw a figure in the shadows. It was a man, but his face was distorted, as if his flesh was burning from the inside. "Have you come to free me?" the creature croaked. "Or to be next?" The priest tried to continue his prayer, but the words were stuck in his throat. The creature stepped forward, and Michael realized that it was the spirit of Ezra. His eyes burned with hatred, and his voice was both muffled and deafening. "You think that faith will save you. There is no place for your God here," the spirit screamed. Michael gathered all his strength and continued his prayer. He raised the cross, and its light illuminated the room. The spirit began to scream as if the light was causing him pain. The symbols on the walls glowed, and then began to disappear one by one. The church shook, as if the earth itself was rejecting it. But the spirit did not give up. It rushed at Michael, grabbing him by the throat. At that moment, the priest remembered the old man's words about spirits being afraid of true faith. He closed his eyes, giving himself over completely to prayer. The light around him grew brighter, and the spirit retreated, screaming in pain. With a loud cry, it disappeared, and the church was plunged into deathly silence. When Michael opened his eyes, it was all over. The church no longer seemed ominous. The morning light penetrated through the windows, illuminating the altar. The symbols were gone, and in their place there was only a clean wall. The locals, hearing that the priest had liberated the church, began to come here again. They thanked Michael for returning the light to this place. But he himself knew that this was not just a scary story. This was real mysticism, proving to him that faith is not just words, but a force capable of withstanding even the darkest horrors. However, several months later, in one of his nightly prayers, Michael heard that same whisper again, and this time, he realized that evil never completely disappears. It only waits for the right moment to return. 6 months passed. The church of St. Augustine now looked completely different. The altar was shining, the walls were repaired, and the services attracted dozens of parishioners. But Father Michael, despite the success of his mission, felt that something was wrong. Deep inside him, there was an uneasiness, a feeling that the ominous darkness he had confronted had not disappeared. One evening, when the church was already empty, Michael decided to stay behind to pray alone. He had barely begun to read the Psalms when he suddenly heard the door creak behind him. Turning around, he saw no one. Only a light breeze swayed the burning candles. But something was wrong. The air became heavy, and the silence deafening. "Who is there?" Michael asked, and his voice echoed under the high vault. A dull thud answered him. This time the sound came from the basement of the church, where he never went. The locals had mentioned this basement, saying that ancient relics were kept there. But now, it seemed to be the source of something sinister. With a cross in one hand and a lantern in the other, Michael opened the heavy wooden door leading down. Descending the creaky steps, he found a dusty room with old books covered in cobwebs scattered everywhere. Among them, one book immediately caught his attention. It lay in the center of the table, and its cover was decorated with strange symbols that he had already seen on the walls of the church. As soon as Michael touched the book, he heard a low hum fill the basement. The light from the lantern began to fade, and a cold wind blew through the room. The pages of the book opened by themselves, and black smoke flowed out, forming a figure. It was Ezra, but now he looked even more terrifying. His eyes glowed red, and his voice became like the roar of a storm. "You thought you defeated me?" he hissed. "I was imprisoned, but you freed me by touching this book." Michael realized he had made a mistake. He began to say a prayer, but Ezra laughed. "Prayers will not help anymore," he said. "You opened the door yourself, and now I am back." The priest rushed to the stairs, but the door slammed in front of him with a crash. Ezra approached, and his shadow covered Michael, as if absorbing the light. In that moment, the priest realized that the only way to stop the evil was to sacrifice himself. With a final prayer, he focused all his faith and strength on destroying the book lying on the table. As soon as the book was destroyed, a bright light filled the basement. Ezra screamed and disappeared in a whirlwind of flames. But with him, Michael disappeared. When the parishioners found him the next day, they saw only ashes where the book had once stood, and a cross lying on the floor. St. Augustine Church became a place of prayer and light once again. But the legend of the priest, who sacrificed himself to save others, remained forever in the hearts of those who knew this terrible mystical story. Several years passed. The Church of St. Augustine continued to gather parishioners, becoming a symbol of salvation and redemption. But those who knew the real history of this place often said that Michael's soul still guarded it from evil. Locals began to notice strange things. Some claimed to have seen the silhouette of a priest at the altar, especially at night. Others heard quiet whispers of prayers coming from the empty church. These stories gave rise to a new wave of rumors, and many began to believe that Michael's spirit remained here to seal away evil forever. One day, a young journalist named Thomas decided to investigate this mystical story. He was a skeptic and did not believe in the supernatural, but the material about a priest who sacrificed himself seemed to him the perfect basis for an article. Arriving in the village, he began to question the residents and collect information. The more he learned, the more his interest grew. Thomas decided to spend the night in the church to personally verify that nothing unusual was happening here. He took a voice recorder, a camera, and a flashlight with him. He was immersed in reading notes about the church's past and didn't notice how it got dark. At midnight, the church was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Thomas heard something rustling behind him. Turning around, he saw only darkness. Shining the flashlight, he discovered that the words, "He is nearby," had appeared on the floor. Thomas quickly began to film what was happening, but the equipment suddenly stopped working. The light from the flashlight flickered and went out. And then he heard a voice. It was the deep, familiar voice of Father Michael. "Go away. It's dangerous here," sounded in the silence. Thomas froze, his mind racing between the desire to escape and his professional interest. But before he could make a choice, a cold wind blew through the room, and the priest's silhouette appeared in its beam of light. Michael's face looked peaceful, but his eyes were worried. "You have opened what should have remained locked," the spirit said. "Go away and do not return. Take care of your soul." And at that moment, Thomas felt the ground beneath his feet begin to tremble. A small hole opened in the center of the church, from which thick black smoke began to flow. Thomas realized that he had nothing more to do here. He ran out of the church, leaving his equipment behind. The next day, Thomas returned to the village. He decided not to publish the material, realizing that some stories are better left untold. But he knew one thing. The Church of St. Augustine would forever remain a place where mysticism and horror were intertwined, and the story of the sacrificial priest would continue to live among those who dared to approach its dark secrets.